In part 2 of our interview with Leo Colborne, we talk a little bit about the challenges facing emerging vendors and how they're different than larger vendors, and actually how they have some advantages in providing customer support. I know some of these issues personally. I ran consulting for a small startup software company. When I came in, our pre-sales guys were doing the installs, and our level 1, level 2 support was done by the guys who were coding the product. So I know what a challenge it can be for small startup companies to provide customer service, as well as providing pre-sales and post-sales support. We're going to talk with Leo a little bit about his unique insight into how smaller companies actually have an advantage because they can more tightly integrate these functions. So Leo, now let's shift gears a little and talk more about emerging companies. We've been talking about how some very large companies deliver customer service. How does that differ for emerging companies? You know, smaller organization, not as many resources. It's a balancing act between R&D and engineering and pre-sales and post-sales. Are these issues different, or are they the same? You know, what do you think of that?
Well, I think the predominant difference in the requirement for the smaller company is there can't be as much of a singular reliance on that support organization as there would be in a larger corporation. And let me tell you what I mean by that. For example, in some of those acquired companies that we had seen, there needs to be a very, very strong involvement by the engineering organization. And one of the things we prided ourselves on, even as a major corporation, was how much integration is there between the engineering and the services organization. How many common initiatives do we have going on to reduce the amount of complexity to do an installation of a product or to provide service on a product. And there are ways to develop products over time to make it much easier for a service organization to deal with those challenges. So in a smaller emerging company, I think a big key is an engineering and service relationship where people are, both organizations are focused on the same thing as far as making it as easy as possible to provide service on that product. And second of all, when there is a problem, because everybody's got them, how quickly can you get it resolved based upon the efforts of the service organization and also having access to the people who develop the product. So that's a key focus, I think, that every smaller company needs to really take into consideration.
So that tight integration, it may be a bit of a double-edged sword. Wouldn't there be some challenges with, you know, balancing pre-sales versus post-sales versus R&D, and having R&D and engineering actually be involved directly in the customer service? Wouldn't that potentially lead to delays in product development and product rollouts?
You would think that, but in my experience, it didn't dilute the focus on the development side. And quite frankly, you know, if there's an issue that a customer has with the product, most engineers want to know, they want feedback on their product. That was also another process that we had in place, and I think a smaller company has to have in place. You know, how's it going? Because the customer in the field is where things happen. And if you don't have a very clear linkage with you know, with certain metrics that are fed back. For example, we used to measure how much time it would take to have somebody do an installation, or how long does it take to actually do a you know, repair. And we would look at ways that we could reduce that amount of time. So you're not going to have that happen if your engineers are kind of stuck in a closet doing product development you know, every day of the week. Most good engineers, they want to get that feedback, and as a result of that, there is that integration between both organizations.
So you actually see this tight integration as an advantage, as basically a feedback loop where the engineers can get direct access to customer challenges, make the product better, make the usability better, maybe even make the products easier to install based on some of that feedback they're getting from the field.
Yeah, absolutely. The other thing is, you know, to not have engineers talk to customers is a mistake. A lot of times you have to watch what they're going to say, but we used to take engineers with us to visit customers because the customers would want an opportunity to talk to the person that's designing the product, to give them input on, what can be made better in the next generation of the product. So I agree with you 100%. There's no way you should keep your engineers away from, the action in the field, for sure. To an extent, obviously.
How about in the area of outsourcing or offshoring? Is that something that uniquely emerging and vendors are embracing because of lack of resources, right? There's only so many folks in a venture-funded or small growing company that can do this. Are they relying on external vendors to maybe do level 1, level 2 call center support? And have you seen some of that, again, in the organizations that you've been integrating in?
I think outsourcing in general, whether it's a smaller company or whether it's a larger company, there is definitely a consideration for outsourcing. Although I think from an industry perspective, it's changed to some degree. A lot of companies today are looking at nearshoring as opposed to offshoring, or to augment offshoring with a nearshoring initiatives. I think the sort of the explosion that occurred a few years ago with everybody's got to outsource. So everybody was, very heavily dependent upon companies in India or the Philippines, and more recently Shanghai and Beijing. So there's got to be some play there, I think. The decisions that need to be made when companies decide they're going to outsource is how much. So do they go full outsourcing and give all the responsibility to the other vendor? Do they have kind of a mix of direct and outsourced people, or do they keep it all in-house? And keeping it all in-house is not the right thing to do, for sure. The other thing that needs to be looked at, I think, from a smaller company standpoint is which products can be outsourced more easily than maybe the more complex ones. Being close in proximity to engineering, for example, as we referred to before, maybe the more complex products, or maybe the more flagship type of products, should be kept more internally. And hardware type remote dial home, as an example, is a perfect opportunity to give to vendors from an outsourcing standpoint. In fact, at EMC, we were almost 100% outsourced with dial homes from the data storage products. But a lot of the complex software products, they were kept internal, and we wanted to keep that close to us and close to engineering.